She had one goal: revenge. Her plan was to kiss a total stranger to make her cheating boyfriend jealous. But she chose the wrong stranger. She didn't know his name was whispered in fear in every dark corner of the city. She just wanted to break a heart. She had no idea she was about to risk her life. The city glittered below, a sprawling galaxy of captured stars, but Ava Collins couldn't feel its magic tonight. From her perch behind the bar at Celeste, New York's most exclusive rooftop lounge, the view was just a painful reminder of how high up she was and how far she could fall. The air, thin and cool, tasted of expensive gin and the faint, sweet perfume of the woman 2 stools down. The soft clinking of ice in glasses and the low, confident murmur of conversations were supposed to be a symphony of success. Tonight, they were the soundtrack to her heartbreaking. It happened in a split second. A moment that stretched and warped until it felt like an eternity. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, expensive whoosh, and there he was. Mark. Her boyfriend of 3 years, the man who was supposed to be at a work dinner in Midtown. His hand was resting on the small of a woman's back, a woman with hair the color of champagne, and a laugh that tinkled like a wind chime. A laugh Ava had heard on the phone when she'd called him last week, the one he swore belonged to his boss's wife. Liar. The breath caught in Ava's throat, a sharp, jagged thing that clawed at her lungs. Her carefully constructed world, built on whispered promises and late-night apologies, crumbled into dust. It wasn't the first time. Oh God, it wasn't the first time. But seeing him with her, so casual, so possessive, so utterly unbothered, it was like a physical blow. The tray in her hand trembled, and a single drop of condensation slid down a martini glass, tracing a path like a tear. Her own eyes burned, hot and furious, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of them, not in front of everyone. She wouldn't cry this time. She wouldn't run to the staff room and choke on sobs while her best friend Chloe rubbed her back and whispered curses against him. No. She was done being the victim in her own life story. Tonight, she wouldn't just break. She would burn. Her gaze darted around the bar, frantic, searching for an escape, an anchor, anything. Her eyes landed on him. A man sitting alone at the far end of the marble countertop. He was an island of stillness in the swirling sea of socialites. Broad shoulders were encased in a suit so perfectly tailored it looked like a second skin, the dark gray material absorbing the soft light of the bar. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't trying to catch anyone's eye. He was just there, watching the city below with an unnerving calm, one hand loosely holding a glass of amber liquid. Everything about him screamed power, quiet, lethal, and absolute. Dark hair, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that, even from this distance, seemed to hold the darkness of the night sky itself. People gave him a wide berth. Even the most obnoxious finance bros seemed to instinctively lower their voices as they passed him. He was a predator resting in plain sight, and no one was stupid enough to get too close. No one but a desperate girl with a shattered heart and nothing left to lose. An idea, wild and reckless, sparked in the wreckage of her mind. It was stupid. It was insane. It was perfect. Before she could talk herself out of it, her feet were moving. She slid out from behind the bar, her movements stiff, robotic. Each step toward him felt a mile long. The floor seemed to sway beneath her feet. Mark had spotted her now. She could feel his gaze on her, a mixture of shock and a flicker of something that looked like guilt, quickly swallowed by annoyance. He hated scenes. Good. She was about to give him the performance of a lifetime. She reached the man. He didn't turn his head, but she knew he was aware of her. She could feel the intensity of his presence, a low hum of energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She stood beside his stool, her hands trembling so hard she clasped them together. She leaned in close, so her words were just for him, a ghost of a sound against the ambient noise. Her voice was a ragged whisper, thick with unshed tears. "Kiss me," she breathed, the words tasting like ash and desperation. His head turned slowly, and for the first time she was caught in the full force of his gaze. His eyes weren't just dark, they were bottomless. They held no warmth, no surprise, just a cool, analytical intelligence that seemed to see right through her flimsy bravado to the broken girl cowering beneath. A tiny, almost invisible muscle twitched in his jaw. He didn't say a word. He just watched her, waiting. Her courage faltered. This was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. But then she saw Mark over the man's shoulder, starting to move toward her, a scowl on his handsome, lying face. Panic surged, white-hot and blinding, giving her one last push. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I just want to make him jealous." She pointed with a subtle tilt of her head. The man's dark eyes flickered over to where Mark stood, then back to her. A flicker of something unreadable passed through their depths. Contempt? Pity? Amusement? She couldn't tell. For a heartbeat, she thought he would laugh or call security or simply turn away and dismiss her as if she were a fly buzzing in his ear. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. Her entire world hung in that single agonizing moment. Then, with an unnerving slowness that sent a shiver down her spine, he gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod.
The city was a grid of light and shadow, a predictable pattern of ambition and decay. From this height, Dominic Valenti could see it all, map it out, control it. Celeste was his. Not on paper, of course. The owner was a legitimate businessman with clean hands and a healthy fear of the IRS. But the real power, the unseen force that ensured the liquor flowed, the clientele was protected, and the problems disappeared before they even started. That was Dominic. This rooftop was a throne, and he was its silent king. He was bored. The meeting had ended an hour ago. A simple exchange of information, a quiet threat delivered with a smile, a new piece of his empire slotted neatly into place. Now, he was just lingering, nursing a glass of bourbon that cost more than most people's weekly rent, and watching the ants scurry below. The people here were just as predictable. The loud laughter, the false smiles, the desperate hunt for connection or status. It was all a performance, a carefully choreographed dance of masks. He knew their secrets, their debts, their weaknesses. It was his business to know. And then, he felt a shift in the air, a small, trembling disturbance in the smooth, predictable flow of the evening. A girl, a waitress. He'd noticed her earlier, only in passing. She was pretty in a wholesome girl-next-door way that was completely out of place in this den of polished predators. Brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail, a smudge of lipstick on her front tooth she didn't know was there, and an aura of quiet efficiency. She was background noise, scenery, until she wasn't. He saw the moment her world broke. He was watching the elevator, a habit born of a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, when the man walked in. Mark Peterson, a small-time real estate developer with a gambling problem and a bigger ego. Dominic knew him. Knew he owed Marco Varelli, one of his capos, over $50,000, and he knew the blonde on his arm was his paralegal. A cheap, sordid little affair, pathetic. He saw the waitress freeze, saw the color drain from her face, the light dim in her wide, expressive eyes. He watched the subtle trembling of her hand, the rigid set of her jaw. He saw the battle waging within her, the fight between humiliation and defiance. It was a familiar battle, one he had seen play out in 100 different ways. Usually, it ended in tears and a quiet retreat. But this girl, she did something different. Her eyes, filled with a storm of pain, scanned the room. When they landed on him, he felt it. Not like a glance, but like a physical touch. A plea. A challenge. He watched, intrigued, as she set her jaw and started walking toward him. It was like watching a fawn walk purposefully into a lion's den. Foolish, reckless, and utterly captivating. She stopped beside him, and he could smell the faint scent of lemons and clean laundry clinging to her uniform. a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes that filled the lounge. She was close. Too close. No one got this close without an invitation. His body tensed, a coiled spring of reflexive violence honed over years of survival. But he remained still. He waited. "Kiss me." The words were so soft he almost didn't hear them. A desperate, fragile plea that cut through the noise of the bar. He turned his head slowly and looked her in the eye. He saw it all there. The raw, unfiltered agony of betrayal. The shimmering veil of tears she was refusing to shed. The sliver of steel in her spine that had carried her across the room to him, the most dangerous man in it. He could have destroyed her with a word. A look. He could have had her thrown out so fast she wouldn't have known what happened. That was what his world demanded. Complications were weaknesses. Emotions were liabilities. And this girl was a walking, talking, breathing complication. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. "I just want to make him jealous." Her gaze flickered toward the pathetic excuse for a man who had hurt her. Dominic's eyes followed. He saw Peterson now puffing up his chest, marching over to reclaim his property. The possessive, arrogant look on his face ignited a cold, quiet flicker of rage deep within Dominic. He hated men like that. Men who broke things just to see them fall. Men who mistook kindness for weakness. He looked back at the girl. At Ava. He didn't know her name yet, but he knew her in that moment. He knew her desperation. And he felt a strange, unfamiliar pull. Maybe it was the defiance in her eyes. Maybe it was the sheer suicidal bravery of her request. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the chance to crush an insect like Mark Peterson under his thumb using nothing more than a simple, unexpected gesture. In a world of complex strategies and bloody wars, the simplicity of it was appealing. He held her gaze for a long moment, letting her see the cold, hard truth of what she was asking, letting her feel the chill of his world. When she didn't flinch, didn't look away, he made his decision. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Game on.
A nod. That was it. A tiny dip of his chin, a movement so small that anyone else would have missed it. But for Ava, in that supercharged, heart-pounding moment, it was a seismic event. The world, which had been spinning out of control, suddenly locked into a new, terrifying orbit. A wave of dizzying relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. He was going to do it. This complete stranger, this monolith of a man with eyes that held galaxies of secrets, was going to help her. What happened next was a blur of motion and sensation. He didn't say a word. He simply placed his glass down on the marble bar with a soft, definitive click. The sound cut through the noise, a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't even known she was writing. He shifted on his stool, turning to face her fully. The sheer size of him was overwhelming. He blocked out the light, the room, everything. There was only him. He lifted a hand, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to push her away. Instead, his fingers, surprisingly gentle, brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was electric, a jolt of lightning that shot straight down her spine. His skin was warm, his touch deliberate. Her breath hitched. This was real. This was happening. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mark, his face twisted in a mask of disbelief and rage. He was just a few feet away now. Perfect. The stranger's dark eyes never left hers. They weren't warm or kind. They were assessing, intense, as if he were memorizing the very soul of her. Then he leaned in. Her small apartment, 3 blocks and a world away from the glamour of Celeste, was her sanctuary. It smelled of turpentine, lavender-scented laundry soap, and the faint, ever-present aroma of burnt toast from her perpetually malfunctioning toaster. Canvases in various states of completion leaned against every available wall space, a chaotic forest of half-finished dreams. Sunsets bled into stormy seas, and portraits of strangers she'd seen on the subway stared out with soulful eyes. This was her real life, her real love. The waitressing job was just the ugly scaffolding that held up this beautiful, fragile structure. She stumbled through the door, the keys fumbling in her trembling hand, and finally managed to slam it shut behind her. The bolt sliding home was the loudest sound she'd ever heard. She leaned her back against the cool wood, her chest heaving as if she'd just run a marathon. Her phone was already buzzing, a frantic, angry vibration against her leg. Mark. Of course. She pulled it out and stared at his name, a fresh wave of nausea rolling through her. With a shaking finger, she declined the call and blocked his number. It felt both monumentally significant and ridiculously small. That better have been the sound of you finally kicking that human-shaped pile of garbage to the curb, a voice called from the living room. Chloe was perched on the arm of the lumpy, second-hand sofa, a tub of ice cream in her lap and the TV remote in her hand. Her fiery red hair was piled in a messy bun, and her sharp green eyes were narrowed with concern. "What are you doing here?" Ava managed, her voice hoarse. "My girl senses were tingling," Chloe said, patting the cushion next to her. "A disturbance in the force. Specifically, the part of the force that involves my best friend and her scumbag boyfriend. So spill. What did he do this time? Forget your anniversary? Accidentally, like another model's bikini picture? Or did he graduate to full-blown public humiliation?" Ava sank onto the sofa, the fight draining out of her, leaving a cold, hollow ache in its place. "All of the above," she whispered. "He showed up at Celeste, with a blonde." Chloe's face hardened. "Oh, that son of a bitch. I'm going to key his car. No, scratch that. I'm going to light his car on fire." A wet, choked laugh escaped Ava's lips. "It's fine." "No, it's not fine, Ava. It's never been fine." Chloe set the ice cream aside, all her attention now focused on her friend. "You deserve so much better. Someone who thinks the sun shines out of your... well, you know. Not some clown who treats your heart like a toy he can pick up and put down whenever he wants." "I know," Ava said, and the words were heavy with 3 years of excuses and second chances. She'd stayed because it was comfortable, because she was scared of being alone, because a tiny, stupid part of her kept hoping he would change, that the charming, wonderful man she'd first fallen for was still in there somewhere. But he wasn't. He was a ghost, a mirage she'd been chasing while the real man broke her heart over and over again. Then the memory of what she'd done flooded back, hot and mortifying. Her face flushed. "I did something crazy," she mumbled into her hands. "Good," Chloe said instantly. "Crazy is an upgrade from sad. What did you do? Throw a drink in his face? Tell his new girl about that weird rash he gets?" "Worse." Ava took a deep breath. "I saw him coming over to me and I just panicked. There was this guy at the bar, a stranger. I walked up to him and I asked him to kiss me." Chloe's jaw dropped. The remote slipped from her hand and clattered to the floor. "You... what?" "I know," Ava cried, her voice rising with hysteria. "It was so stupid. I just wanted to wipe that smug look off Mark's face. I wanted him to feel, just for a second, a tiny fraction of the pain he's caused me." "Okay, wait, back up," Chloe said, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and delight. "This stranger, what did he look like? Please tell me he wasn't a 90-year-old tourist with a fanny pack." Ava shook her head, a shiver tracing its way down her spine as she pictured him. "No. He was intense, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my car. He looked like he could kill a man with a stare. And the craziest part?" she whispered, her voice full of awe. "He did it." Chloe leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He kissed you? Right there at the bar?" Ava nodded, her mind replaying the moment. The feel of his hand on her cheek, the scent of expensive bourbon and something else, something uniquely him. Clean, masculine, and dangerous. The way he'd looked at her, as if he could see every broken piece of her. It wasn't a kiss she'd ever forget.
Control. Dominic Valenti's entire life was built on a foundation of absolute, unwavering control. He controlled his emotions, his empire, and every single person within it. Surprises were for the weak. Unpredictability was a cancer that had to be cut out before it could spread. Yet here he was, in the sterile silence of his penthouse office overlooking the city, and the only thing he could think about was the utter chaos of the last hour. A girl. A waitress with eyes full of a righteous storm and a plea that had somehow bypassed every one of his defenses. He replayed the moment in his mind, dissecting it with the same cold precision he applied to a business deal. Her desperate whisper, the trembling of her body as she stood beside him, the raw, undiluted pain in her gaze. He had seen fear, greed, and ambition in people's eyes 1,000,000 times. But this was different. It was a vulnerability so profound it was its own kind of strength. She had weaponized her heartbreak. He had agreed. An illogical move. An emotional variable introduced into a stable equation. He shouldn't have done it. But the sight of Mark Peterson, that preening, worthless peacock, had stirred something cold and dark inside him. Dominic had a deep, abiding hatred for bullies, for men who used their power, however insignificant, to crush those they deemed beneath them. And in that moment, the girl's request wasn't just about jealousy. It was an act of rebellion, a small, defiant stand against a petty tyrant, and he had decided to be her weapon. Problem, boss? Dominic didn't turn. He didn't have to. He recognized the voice of Leo Moretti, his right-hand man, his consigliere, and the closest thing he had to a friend. Leo was a man whose face was a roadmap of battles won and loyalties kept, with graying temples and eyes that had seen far too much but missed nothing. The Petrovs are getting restless, Dominic said, his voice a low rumble. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city below. Ivan made a move on the sanitation contracts in the Bronx. He's a dog chasing cars. He wouldn't know what to do if he caught one, Leo replied, his tone dismissive. A word to the union president should be enough to remind him where his territory ends. Do it, Dominic ordered. The conversation was routine, the familiar rhythm of their world, power shifts, threats, and countermeasures. It was a language he understood, a world he controlled. There was a moment of silence. Leo knew him too well. He knew there was something else. Something happened tonight, Leo stated. Not a question. Dominic finally turned from the window. His office was like him, stark, minimalist, and unforgiving. A black desk, 2 chairs, and walls of glass. There were no personal effects, no pictures, no clutter. Nothing to show a hint of the man behind the boss. Except for one thing. On the corner of his desk, face down, was a small silver picture frame. A complication, Dominic said simply. Leo raised a skeptical eyebrow. You don't have complications. You have problems, and you eliminate them. Dominic walked to his desk and picked up the silver frame, his thumb stroking the cool metal. He didn't turn it over. The waitress at Celeste, the one with the brown hair. Leo's expression didn't change, but a flicker of understanding entered his eyes. He had been there, in the corner, watching everything. He always was. The girl with the boyfriend problem. Find out everything about her, Dominic said. The order was quiet, but it carried the weight of an iron decree. Her name, where she lives, her family, her fears, what she wants from life. Everything. And find out what you can use to squeeze Mark Peterson until he pops. This was unusual. Dominic Valenti didn't involve himself in the messy domestic disputes of civilians. He operated on a different plane, one where emotions were a fatal flaw. Leo's silence was a testament to how far outside the lines Dominic was stepping. Consider it done, Leo said finally, his loyalty overriding his curiosity. He turned to leave. Leo, Dominic said, stopping him at the door. Be discreet. I don't want her to know she's being watched. Of course. Leo nodded and disappeared, closing the door soundlessly behind him. Dominic was alone again. He sank into his leather chair, the silence of the room pressing in on him. Why? Why was he doing this? It wasn't just about punishing Peterson. It was about her. The feel of her, trembling against him. The wild, desperate hope in her eyes when he'd nodded. For the first time in a long, long time, someone hadn't looked at him with fear or greed. They had looked at him for help. His fingers finally turned the silver frame over. The photo was old and faded. It was of a young woman with his eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers. His mother. Taken just a year before his father's betrayal had shattered their family and taught a 10-year-old Dominic the brutal lesson that love was the most dangerous vulnerability of all. He'd spent the next 20 years building walls around his heart, fortifying them with power and fear. But tonight, a heartbroken waitress with nothing but courage and a stupid, reckless plan had walked right up to those walls, and for a reason he couldn't fathom, he'd just opened the gate.
He leaned in, and the world tilted on its axis. The low hum of the lounge, the clinking glasses, the distant city lights, it all faded into a muted, faraway roar. There was only the sharp, clean scent of his cologne, the faint aroma of expensive bourbon, and the overwhelming presence of him. His hand, which had been resting on her cheek, slid into her hair, his fingers tangling gently at the nape of her neck. It wasn't a rough or possessive grip. It was a gesture of quiet command, anchoring her in place. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden silence of her senses. This was it. The point of no return. Her eyes fluttered shut. His lips met hers. For a kiss born of such ugly desperation, it was devastatingly tender. There was no forceful passion, no aggressive claiming. It was a firm, warm pressure that spoke of a control so absolute it was more intimidating than any show of force. It was brief, lasting only a few seconds, but in that small pocket of time, Ava's universe was rewritten. She could feel the slight scratch of his stubble against her skin, the surprising softness of his lips, the way he held her as if she were made of glass. It was a kiss of questions, not answers, a spark in a powder keg, and it was exactly what she needed. It seared away the memory of Mark's careless pecks and false promises, branding her with something new, something powerful and unknown. When he pulled back, the sounds of the lounge rushed back in. He was still close, his dark eyes searching hers, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something flicker in their depths. Not just curiosity, but something hotter, more possessive. Then it was gone, shuttered away behind a mask of cool indifference. He released her, and she swayed slightly, the connection broken. She felt a chill where his hand had been. Her gaze shot past him, finding Mark. He was frozen in place, his face a mottled canvas of shock, fury, and something that looked suspiciously like hurt. The woman beside him looked confused, her perfectly painted smile faltering. It worked. A wild, triumphant surge of adrenaline shot through Ava. She had done it. She had taken back a tiny piece of her own power. The victory was heady, intoxicating, but it was quickly followed by a cold wave of fear. What had she just done? She had used this man, this powerful, intimidating stranger, like a prop in her own pathetic drama. He turned back to his drink as if nothing had happened, presenting his broad back to her. The dismissal was absolute. She was a means to an end, and the end had been met. Mortification washed over her. She needed to get out of there. Now. Ava! Mark's voice was a low hiss behind her. She turned, her stomach twisting into a knot. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep hard. The triumphant feeling vanished, replaced by the familiar, sickening dread. "What the hell was that?" he snarled, his face close to hers. His breath smelled of wine and jealousy. "Are you trying to humiliate me? Who the hell is that guy?" "Let go of me, Mark," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was like a vice. "Not until you tell me what's going on. You can't just go around kissing strange men. Are you sleeping with him?" It's none of your business what I do anymore, she shot back, the words tasting like freedom and terror. We're done. We're done when I say we're done, he growled, giving her arm a shake. Now you're going to come with me and we're going to talk about this. A shadow fell over them. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. She told you to let her go. The voice was quiet, devoid of emotion. A flat, cold statement of fact. It was him, the stranger. He hadn't even turned around, but his presence was a physical weight, pressing down on them. Mark stiffened, but his arrogance wouldn't let him back down. This is a private conversation. Stay out of it. Slowly, deliberately, the man swiveled on his stool. He didn't get up. He didn't need to. He looked at Mark, his dark eyes completely empty, and then his gaze dropped to where Mark's hand was still clamped around Ava's arm. You have 3 seconds, the man said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. Before that hand is no longer attached to your arm.
The moment his lips touched hers, he knew he had made a mistake. Not because the act was wrong, but because it was potent. He had expected to feel nothing. It was a strategic move, a simple action to achieve a desired result. He was supposed to be the detached puppeteer pulling the strings, but he wasn't prepared for the jolt. She tasted of desperation, salt from the tears she was holding back, and a surprising sweetness, like wild honey. She trembled under his touch, her body a fragile, humming wire of pure emotion. He held her gently, his instincts warring with each other. One side of him, the cold, calculating boss, registered the action's success as he saw Peterson's face contort with rage. The other side, the man he kept locked away, was consumed with the feel of her, the way her scent filled his senses, the quiet gasp she gave when he pulled away. For a split second, he had the primal urge to pull her back, to deepen the kiss, to claim what he had only sampled. He shut it down, immediately, ruthlessly. He released her and turned back to his bourbon, erecting his walls brick by painful brick. He had his answer. The girl was a complication he could not afford. She was a spark of warmth in his frozen world, and warmth melted ice, compromised structural integrity. He would let her walk away, and that would be the end of it. He would deal with Peterson separately, a simple business transaction of pain for disrespect. He took a sip of his drink, the liquor burning a familiar path down his throat. He listened to her footsteps start to retreat, then stop. He heard Peterson's hiss, the ugly, possessive tone that set his teeth on edge. What the hell was that? Who the hell is that guy? Dominic's hand tightened on his glass, the thick crystal groaning under the pressure. He had given her what she wanted. His part in this was over. He should leave. Let her fight her own battles. Getting involved further was a tactical error. Then he heard the unmistakable sound of a struggle, the girl's strained voice. Let go of me, Mark. And Peterson's reply, we're done when I say we're done. Something cold and black uncoiled in Dominic's gut. It was the ancient, familiar rage he had learned to master, to wield like a weapon. The rage of a boy who had watched his father strike his mother for speaking out of turn. The rage of a man who understood that true power wasn't in brute force, but in the absolute violation of another's will. Peterson wasn't just angry. He was claiming ownership, and he was doing it over something Dominic had, however briefly, touched. His decision was no longer tactical. It was instinct. She told you to let her go, he said, his voice low and carrying. He didn't need to shout. The threat was in the stillness, the absolute certainty of the words. When the pathetic fool tried to challenge him, Dominic turned. He let the full, chilling emptiness of his gaze fall on the man. He had cultivated that look for years. It was the look that ended arguments before they began, the look that made hardened men break out in a cold sweat. He saw Peterson's bravado flicker, the first seed of fear taking root in his eyes. Dominic's gaze dropped to the offending hand on the girl's arm, a mark of filth on something clean. "You have 3 seconds," he said, the words falling like chips of ice into the sudden silence. "Before that hand is no longer attached to your arm." He didn't make threats. He made promises. The change in Mark Peterson was instantaneous. The anger in his eyes was consumed by pure animal terror. The color drained from his face. His hand flew off Ava's arm as if he'd been burned. He stumbled back, his eyes wide, finally understanding that he had picked a fight with a shark, thinking it was a goldfish. I'm sorry," Peterson stammered, not to Ava, but to Dominic. I didn't know she was with you." "She's not," Dominic said, his voice dropping even lower, making the words more menacing. "And that makes it worse. Get out. And if I ever see you near her again, I will personally introduce you to a world of pain you can't even begin to imagine." Peterson didn't need to be told twice. He practically fell over himself in his haste to get away, casting one last terrified look over his shoulder before disappearing into the elevator. The immediate area around them had gone silent. People were staring, sensing the shift in power, the sudden, sharp edge of violence that had cut through the polite atmosphere. Dominic stood up, his full height eclipsing Ava. She was staring at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the delicate hollow of her throat. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple black metal card. It was completely blank except for a single phone number etched in silver. He held it out to her. Her hand was shaking as she took it. Her fingers brushed his, and the small jolt was there again. A secret current passing between them. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "A solution," he said, his voice flat, emotionless once more. "If he bothers you again, you call that number. Someone will answer. You tell them my name, and your problem will go away. Permanently." He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her standing there in the sudden, deafening silence, holding a piece of his world in her trembling hand. He had just broken his most important rule. He had not only gotten involved, he had given a complete stranger a direct line into his life. The complication was no longer a possibility, it was a reality. And as he stepped into the elevator, he knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was far from over.
The walk home was a 3-block journey through a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Ava couldn't decide. The city lights blurred into long, wet streaks of neon, though it wasn't raining. Her feet moved on autopilot, her legs feeling like they were filled with cotton. In her pocket, her hand was clamped around the black metal card. It was cold and heavy, a stark, rectangular piece of reality in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. It felt dangerous, like holding a loaded gun. She didn't stop until the door to her apartment was bolted behind her. The silence was a crushing weight. She slid the card out of her pocket and placed it on her small kitchen counter. It lay there, stark and black against the chipped white laminate absorbing the light. A phone number, a solution. You tell them my name, and your problem will go away. Permanently. A violent shiver racked her body. What kind of man said things like that? What kind of man could make Mark, arrogant, entitled Mark, cower and run like a frightened child with just a few quiet words? She knew the answer, of course. A dangerous one. The kind of man who lived in a world of shadows and violence, a world she wanted no part of. Her phone buzzed against the countertop, a loud, angry sound in the quiet room. Mark. Her thumb hovered over the decline button. Before she could press it, a text message popped up beneath his name. Mark. Ava, baby, pick up. We need to talk about this. Another buzz. Mark. I'm sorry. I was an idiot. She meant nothing. You know you're the only one for me. The words were so familiar, a script she had read 100 times before. The apologies, the excuses, the empty promises, but this time they didn't sting. They just felt pathetic. She let the phone ring until it went to voicemail, her eyes fixed on the black card. Then the tone of the texts shifted. Mark. So you're just going to ignore me? After 3 years? Throw it all away because of one mistake? Mark, who was that guy? You think you're so tough with him around? He can't protect you forever. That last message sent a spike of pure ice through her veins. A threat. It was veiled, childish even, but it was there. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. She stared at it, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her gaze flicked from the vibrating phone to the silent waiting card. A solution. All she had to do was pick it up, dial the number. No, she couldn't. She wouldn't trade one monster for another. With a surge of defiant energy, she snatched her phone, declined the call, and blocked Mark's number. Then she blocked him on every social media platform she could think of. A digital exorcism. It felt good, clean. She took a deep, shuddering breath, feeling lighter than she had in years. She would handle this herself. She didn't need any dangerous stranger's help. She shoved the card into the back of her junk drawer, underneath old batteries and tangled charging cords, and tried to forget it existed. For 2 days, there was silence. A blessed, beautiful peace. Ava threw herself into her painting, letting the vibrant colors and the familiar scrape of the brush on canvas soothe her frayed nerves. She quit her job at Celeste, telling her manager she was pursuing her art full-time, a lie that tasted sweet on her tongue. It felt like a new beginning. The illusion shattered on the 3rd day. A bouquet of funereal-looking lilies arrived at her apartment, the card reading, "You can't hide from me. M." Later that night, as she was taking out the trash, she saw his car parked across the street, just sitting there in the darkness. He didn't get out. He just watched. The next morning, her tires were slashed. The fear came back cold and suffocating. This wasn't the Mark she knew. The cheating, lying, cowardly Mark. This was someone else. Someone unhinged and obsessive. She called the police, but without proof, all they could do was file a report and tell her to be careful. That night, she found herself back at Celeste. She'd told her boss she'd work one last shift to help train her replacement. The real reason was that she was terrified to be alone in her apartment. The rooftop lounge, once the scene of her humiliation, now felt like the safest place in the world, full of lights and people and security. She was wiping down the bar, her movements mechanical, when a low voice spoke from behind her, so close it made her jump. "I was hoping I might find you here." She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. It was him, the stranger. He was dressed more casually tonight, in a dark Henley that stretched across his broad chest and dark jeans, but the aura of power around him was just as potent. He looked out of place without his suit, like a panther forced to sit in a gilded cage. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice coming out as a breathless squeak. "I seem to have misplaced a pair of cufflinks the other night," he said smoothly, his eyes scanning the bar. The excuse was so flimsy, it was almost insulting. His gaze came to rest on her face, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You look tired." "It's been a long week," she said, avoiding his eyes. She didn't want him to see the fear there. She didn't want him to know he was right, that she needed his help. "Has your former problem been respecting your boundaries?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She hesitated, the lie dying on her lips. His gaze was too intense, too knowing. He wasn't asking a question. He was confirming a fact. She gave a small, defeated shake of her head. He nodded slowly, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "I see." He didn't offer help. He didn't mention the card. He just watched her, and in his gaze she saw a flicker of something that looked like anger. A protective anger. It was terrifying and, to her shame, a little comforting. He changed the subject, his eyes falling on a small notepad by the register where she'd been sketching a customer's profile while things were slow. "You're an artist." The observation caught her off guard. "I just doodle. It's a hobby." "Don't lie," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It's not a hobby. It's who you are." He tapped the notepad with a long finger. "You capture people. Not just what they look like, but how they feel. This man, he said, indicating the sketch, is arrogant, but he's deeply insecure. You saw that. She stared at him, speechless. No one had ever looked at her silly little sketches and seen that. Not even Mark. This man, this stranger she had known for all of 10 minutes, saw her more clearly than the man she had spent 3 years with. A strange, warm feeling unfurled in her chest, a dangerous little flower of hope. Maybe he wasn't a monster. Maybe he was just a man who understood darkness.
Dominic hated waiting. It was a passive state, a surrender of control. And for the past 3 days he had been doing nothing but waiting. Waiting for a phone call that never came. His mind should have been on the Petrovs, on the shipment arriving at the docks on Friday, on the 1,000 other moving parts of his empire. But instead, it was consumed by the image of a waitress with defiant brown eyes, Ava. Leo's report had been on his desk within hours. Ava Collins, 26. Orphaned at 16, raised by an aunt in Queens. No siblings. One close friend, Chloe. A mountain of student debt from a fine arts degree she wasn't using. A clean record. A quiet life. A life that Mark Peterson was currently trying to set on fire. Leo's other report, the one on Peterson, detailed every pathetic text, every unanswered call, every moment he spent parked outside her building like a ghoul. It ended with a picture of her slashed tires. When Dominic saw that, a cold, precise rage settled in his bones. This was no longer about disrespect. This was about terrorizing someone who was now, for a reason he refused to analyze, under his protection. She hasn't called, Dominic stated, staring out his office window. Leo stood by the door, his expression impassive. She's proud. Or she's scared. Probably both. Pride won't protect her, Dominic growled. Fear is what's keeping her alive, but it's also what's keeping her from making the right call. What are your orders? Leo asked. Dominic turned from the window. The internal battle was over. She wouldn't come to him, so he would go to her. He wouldn't force his help on her, but he would stand close enough that she could reach for it when she was ready to let go of her pride. Tighten the surveillance. I want a man inside her building and another one across the street, 24/7. Peterson gets within 50 feet of her. You have my permission to break his legs. Make sure he can't prove who did it. And I want a full financial workup on his real estate business. Find his every weakness, every dirty deal. I'm going to dismantle his life so completely he won't have time to worry about a girl he once knew. And you? Leo asked, a hint of caution in his voice. I'm going to go find my cufflinks, Dominic said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Walking back into Celeste felt different this time. He wasn't the king on his throne. He was an intruder in her world. He saw her behind the bar, and the sight of her sent a strange, unfamiliar pang through his chest. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her movements were tense, brittle. She was trying to project an aura of calm, but he could see the fear clinging to her like a second skin. He could see her flinch every time the door opened. He approached the bar, his excuse ready, but when he saw her up close, the lie felt stupid and transparent. He settled for the truth, wrapped in a lie. He saw the panic in her eyes when she saw him, and it twisted something inside him. He was the source of her original problem, and now he was the only solution to her new one. Their conversation was brief, charged with everything left unsaid. When she admitted, with just a shake of her head, that Peterson was still bothering her, the cold rage he'd felt earlier solidified into a diamond-hard point of purpose. Peterson's fate was sealed in that moment. But then he saw the sketchbook, a glimpse of the real Ava, the soul beneath the fear. He saw the lines, the shading, the life she breathed onto the page. He saw her talent. More than that, he saw her insight. She saw the world, saw the people in it, with a clarity that was rare. She saw the cracks in their facades, the sadness behind their smiles, and he found himself wanting, with a sudden, sharp hunger, to know what she would see if she ever truly looked at him. He left the lounge with a sense of grim satisfaction. He had seen her, spoken to her. She was scared, but she was a fighter. He respected that. He walked out onto the street, the cool night air doing nothing to quell the fire in his gut. His phone buzzed. It was Leo. "Boss, we have a problem. It's not Peterson." Dominic's body went rigid. "Talk to me." "One of my guys, who was watching the lounge, just checked in. Dmitry Petrov was here tonight. He sat in a corner booth for 2 hours. He wasn't meeting anyone, he was just watching." Dominic's blood ran cold. Dmitry, Ivan Petrov's youngest, most vicious son. "What was he watching?" Dominic asked, though he already knew the answer. "He was watching you," Leo said, his voice grim. "And when you were talking to the girl, he wasn't watching you anymore. He was watching her." Dominic looked back up at the glittering rooftop of Celeste. The girl with the artist's soul was no longer just being harassed by a jealous ex-boyfriend. She had just appeared on the radar of his most ruthless enemy. He had tried to offer her a simple solution, but instead, he had just made her the target in a war she didn't even know was being fought.
Leaving Celeste, the cool night air felt like a balm on Ava's flushed cheeks. The city seemed quieter tonight, the usual cacophony of sirens and traffic muted, as if holding its breath. Her strange encounter with the man from the bar, the man whose name she still didn't know, had left her completely unsettled. One moment he was a terrifying shadow, the next he was looking at her sketchbook and seeing a part of her soul she rarely showed anyone. "It's not a hobby. It's who you are." The words echoed in her mind, a dangerous, seductive whisper. She clutched the strap of her bag, her footsteps quickening as she turned off the main avenue onto the quieter side street that led to her apartment. The familiar fear of Mark lurking in the shadows returned, a cold knot in her stomach. She scanned the parked cars, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm. But it wasn't Mark's car she should have been looking for. It happened without a sound, without a warning. 1 second, she was walking under the halo of a flickering streetlight. The next, a dark, windowless van screeched to a halt beside her, its tires screaming in protest against the asphalt. The side door slid open with a violent thump and 2 figures spilled out. They were big men dressed in black, their faces obscured by shadows and grim purpose. This wasn't Mark. This was something else entirely. A cold, professional dread seized her, far more potent than the fear of a jealous ex. "Hey!" she yelled, stumbling backward, her hand fumbling in her bag for her keys, her phone, anything. They didn't speak. They moved with a chilling efficiency. One lunged for her, his hand clamping over her mouth, stifling her scream before it could fully form. The smell of stale cigarettes and leather filled her senses. The other grabbed her around the waist, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing. Panic, raw and blinding, exploded in her chest. She thrashed wildly, kicking her legs, landing a solid blow to one man's shin. He grunted in pain but didn't loosen his grip. Her bag fell to the ground, its contents spilling across the dirty pavement. Her wallet, a tube of lipstick, her sketchbook. The drawings scattered, pages fluttering in the slight breeze like wounded birds. The man holding her waist began dragging her toward the open maw of the van. Her mind screamed, this was it. This was how it ended. Dragged into a van on a Tuesday night. No one would ever know what happened. Suddenly, a new figure shot out of the darkness. An older man, wiry and fast, with graying hair and the movements of a predator. He moved with impossible speed, slamming into the man whose hand was over her mouth. There was a sickening crunch as the older man drove his elbow into the attacker's face. The hand over her mouth vanished, and Ava gasped for air, her scream finally tearing from her throat. The man holding her waist cursed and threw her to the ground. She landed hard, the concrete scraping her knees and palms. Scrambling backward, she watched in horror as the older man, her rescuer, engaged the 2 thugs. It wasn't a brawl. It was a brutal, calculated dance of violence. He moved with a precision that spoke of a lifetime of fighting, but he was 1 against 2. One of the thugs pulled out a short metal pipe. The older man disarmed him with a swift, brutal movement, but the distraction was enough. The other man landed a vicious punch to his side, and her rescuer staggered back with a grunt of pain, clutching his ribs. He was hurt. He was losing. Just as the men advanced on him, twin beams of blinding light cut through the darkness. A black sedan, sleek and menacing, fishtailed around the corner and screeched to a halt, its headlights pinning the entire scene in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The driver's side door opened, and he got out, the man from the bar. The change in the atmosphere was absolute. If the older man was a wolf, this man was the devil himself. He didn't run or shout. He walked toward the two thugs with a calm, deliberate stride that was more terrifying than any war cry. The air crackled with a silent, lethal energy. His face, illuminated by the headlights, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes weren't just dark, they were black holes of rage. The two thugs froze, their aggression evaporating into pure, primal fear. One of them took an involuntary step back. It was the only opening Dominic needed. He moved in a blur, his fist connecting with the first man's jaw with a sound like a bat cracking. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he hit the pavement. The second thug, the one with the pipe, swung it wildly. Dominic sidestepped the clumsy attack, seized the man's wrist, and twisted. A sickening snap echoed in the alley, followed by a scream of agony. Dominic didn't stop. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, doubling him over, then brought his clasped hands down on the back of his neck. The second man collapsed in a heap. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The alley fell silent. The only sounds the pained groans of the defeated men, the distant wail of approaching sirens, and Ava's own ragged, hysterical breaths. The older man, Leo, was leaning against the wall, clutching his side, his face pale but his eyes alert. Dominic stood in the center of the chaos, his knuckles bloody, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He wasn't even breathing hard. He had just dismantled 2 men with the efficiency of a butcher dressing a carcass. Ava pushed herself up, her body trembling so violently she could barely stand. The world was a dizzying, tilting mess. None of this made sense. The attack, the impossible rescue, the sheer, brutal violence of the man standing before her. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture so horrifying she couldn't bear to look at it. Who are you? She stammered, the words catching in her throat. Her gaze darted from his bloody hands to the groaning men on the ground. What is happening? Why did they attack me? Why are you here? He turned to face her, and the cold fury in his eyes was replaced by something else, something that looked like regret. The sirens were getting closer. Ava, he started, his voice a low, rough rasp. No, she screamed, taking a stumbling step back. Don't you dare say my name. You know my name. You had me watched, didn't you? That man, she pointed a shaking finger at Leo. He was following me. This is because of you. All of this is because of you. The realization hit her like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The kiss, the fight with Mark, the card. It wasn't a solution, it was a curse. She had stumbled out of her small, broken world and fallen headfirst into his. Tell me who you are, she demanded, her voice rising to a hysterical shriek. Right now.
He watched her break. Standing there in the harsh glare of his car's headlights covered in grime, her eyes wide with terror and dawning comprehension, she was the most beautiful and tragic thing he had ever seen, and he was the one who had broken her. Every protective instinct screamed at him to lie, to shield her, to spin some story about being in the right place at the right time. But the time for lies was over. Lies wouldn't protect her from the Petrovs. Lies were a flimsy shield against the war that was coming to her doorstep. To protect her, he had to drag her into the fortress of his world, even if the gate was made of iron and the rooms were filled with ghosts. And the only way to do that was with the brutal, soul-shattering truth. The sirens were a mournful symphony growing closer. Leo was hurt. His men would be here in seconds to clean this up, to make the problem, and the bodies, disappear. But he only had this moment. This one terrible moment of clarity with her. He saw the accusation in her eyes, the terror mixing with betrayal. She had pieced it together. She was smart. That was one of the things that had drawn him to her. Her intelligence now was a weapon pointed directly at his heart. "Tell me who you are," she shrieked, her voice raw with pain. He took a step toward her, holding his hands up slightly, showing her they were empty, though they were stained with the violence he'd just committed on her behalf. "Ava, you need to listen to me. You need to come with me right now. You're not safe here." "Safe?" She laughed, a wild, unhinged sound that clawed at his insides. "I was perfectly safe until I met you. My biggest problem was my cheating boyfriend. Now men are trying to throw me into a van. I am not going anywhere with you until you tell me the truth." He looked into her eyes, those beautiful, terrified eyes, and he knew he had to do it. He had to give her the weapon that would make her hate him forever, because it was the only thing that would make her understand the gravity of her situation. It was the only thing that might convince her to let him save her life. He took a deep breath, the sirens now just a block or two away. He had to end this. "My name is Dominic Valenti," he said, his voice quiet and heavy, each word a stone dropping into the abyss between them. He watched her face, watched for the flicker of recognition, the dawning horror. He saw it. The Valenti name still carried weight in this city, a name whispered in fear and reverence. He pressed on, twisting the knife because it was the only way. "I run the Valenti family." He didn't say the word. Mafia. He didn't have to. It hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. He saw the last vestiges of hope in her eyes die. He watched as the image of him as a mysterious, powerful protector shattered, replaced by the grotesque image of a mob boss, a monster, a man who dealt in violence and death. Her face went slack with shock, her skin paling until she looked like a porcelain doll. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, that's not. You can't be." The connection they had shared, that fragile, tentative spark that had ignited over a sketchbook and a desperate kiss, was gone. He had snuffed it out with the truth of his name. In her eyes, he was no longer a man. He was the source of all her pain, the embodiment of the nightmare she was now living. And he knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical wound, that protecting her body would be easy compared to the impossible task of ever winning back her trust.
The Valenti family? The name wasn't just a name, it was a story. A dark fairy tale whispered on the streets of New York. A story of power, of shadows, of men who moved outside the law and answered to no one. Ava had heard it, of course, in the same way she'd heard of dragons and ghosts, as something that existed in a world far, far away from her own. Now, the monster from the fairy tale was standing in front of her, his hands stained with blood he had shed for her. The wail of the sirens grew louder, a frantic screaming crescendo that matched the chaos in her mind. His words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "I run the Valenti family." It was a confession and a cage, and the walls were closing in. "No," she whispered, but the denial was a lie. It made a terrible, perfect sense. The power he radiated, the fear he inspired in Mark, the way people at Celeste parted for him like the sea. He wasn't just a rich businessman. He was a king in a kingdom of crime. 2 more black sedans screeched into the alley, their doors opening before they'd fully stopped. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the same silent, deadly efficiency as their leader. They didn't look at her. They moved past her as if she were a ghost, one going to Leo's side, others efficiently and brutally hauling the groaning thugs to their feet and shoving them into one of the cars. It was a well-oiled machine of violence, and she was standing in the middle of it. "Ava, you have to come with me," Dominic Valenti, said again, his voice urgent, cutting through her paralysis. He took a step toward her. That single step broke the spell. A primal instinct deeper than thought took over. Run. She turned and fled. She didn't know where she was going, only that it was away. Away from him, from the blood and the sirens and the terrible truth. She scrambled for her fallen bag, her fingers closing around the strap, and then she was sprinting down the street, her scraped knees screaming in protest. "Ava!" His voice, sharp and commanding, echoed behind her. She didn't look back. She ran with tears streaming down her face, a raw, ragged sob tearing from her lungs. She ran past surprised pedestrians, her vision blurring, the city lights becoming a smear of hostile colors. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every car that slowed down was a potential kidnapper. His world had contaminated hers, and now she saw monsters everywhere. She didn't stop running until she was 2 blocks away, collapsing against the cold brick wall of a building, gasping for air, her side stitched with a sharp, stabbing pain. She was alone. He hadn't followed. Or maybe he had people following her she couldn't see. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. There was only one place to go, one person she could trust. Fumbling for her phone with hands that shook uncontrollably, she called Chloe. 20 minutes later, the door to Chloe's 5th-floor walk-up was thrown open. Chloe took one look at Ava's tear-stained face, her ripped jeans, and the blood on her knees, and pulled her inside without a word. She locked the 3 deadbolts, her face a mask of furious concern. "What happened?" Chloe demanded, her voice low and fierce as she guided Ava to the sofa. "Was it Mark? I swear to God I will end him." "No!" Ava choked out, shaking her head as the whole story came tumbling out in a torrent of panicked, disjointed sentences. The van, the attack, the rescue, and the final devastating reveal. "His name is Dominic Valenti, Chloe, the man who kissed me. He's a mob boss." Chloe stared at her, her green eyes wide with disbelief, then horror. "Oh, Ava, oh, honey, no." That night, Ava didn't sleep. She sat curled in a ball on Chloe's sofa, wrapped in a blanket that couldn't stop the shivering. Every creak of the old building, every siren in the distance, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She was a fly caught in a spider's web, and she had flown into it herself. The next morning, fueled by coffee and terror, she made a plan. She called her apartment's superintendent and told him there was a gas leak and she'd be staying with a friend for a while. A lie. She packed a small bag at Chloe's, stuffing it with the few clothes Chloe could lend her. She turned her phone off and removed the SIM card. She was going to disappear. "This is insane," Chloe said, watching her with worried eyes. "You can't just run." "I have to," Ava insisted, her voice hollow. "He'll be looking for me. His enemies will be looking for me. My life, my real life, is over if I don't run now. I'll go somewhere small, change my name, start over." It sounded like a plot from a movie, flimsy and unrealistic, but it was the only hope she could cling to. For a few days, the plan seemed to work. Hiding in Chloe's apartment, she felt a fragile sense of safety. The world outside the window was muted. The silence from her phone was a relief. She started to breathe again, tiny, shallow breaths of freedom. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe Dominic Valenti had bigger problems to deal with than a waitress who ran away. Maybe he would just let her go. The hope was a fool's dream. It was a Friday morning. Chloe had gone to work, leaving Ava alone with her thoughts. A soft thump at the front door made her freeze. She crept to the door, her heart in her throat, and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Her breath escaped in a shaky sigh. Probably just a package for a neighbor. But a sliver of white was visible under the door. A note. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the deadbolts and opened the door just a crack. On the doormat was a small white box, tied with a simple black ribbon, and tucked under the ribbon was the note. It was a single, pristine white card. The writing on it was an elegant, terrifying script. "We know who you are. We know where you are. He can't protect you everywhere." A wave of nausea washed over her. Her blood ran cold. With a sense of sickening dread, she knelt and lifted the lid off the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a small, dead bird. A sparrow. Its neck was twisted at an unnatural angle, its delicate feathers ruffled. It was a message of ultimate finality, a promise of death. Her fragile hope didn't just break, it was obliterated. They had found her. They had walked right up to her door, to her one safe place in the entire world, and left this omen. Running was useless. Hiding was a joke. There was no escape. Dominic Valenti's world had found her, and it was never, ever going to let her go. She was trapped, a bird in a cage waiting for the predators to finally strike. The situation was utterly, completely hopeless.
He watched her run. He stood in the chaos of the alley, his men moving around him like ghosts, and the only thing he could see was her retreating back, her silhouette growing smaller and smaller until she was swallowed by the city's shadows. The sound of her ragged sob had been like a knife in his gut. He had never felt so utterly powerless. He, who could command armies and topple empires with a single phone call, could do nothing to stop the terrified flight of one girl. "Boss?" Leo's voice was strained. He was leaning heavily on one of Dominic's men, his hand pressed to his ribs. "She's gone." "I know," Dominic said, his own voice a low, gravelly thing. He turned, the cold mask of the boss sliding back into place. The flicker of emotion he'd allowed himself was a weakness he could no longer afford. "Get in the car, Leo. We'll take you to Dr. Almasi's clinic. The rest of you, clean this up. I want these two scum awake and talkative in an hour. Find out who sent them and what they know." His men moved to obey without question. In the car, speeding through the night, the city lights were a cold, indifferent blur. Leo was breathing heavily in the seat beside him. "She'll be terrified," Leo said, wincing as the car hit a pothole. "She has a right to be," Dominic replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He was driving himself, needing the physical act of control to keep the rage from boiling over. "I brought this to her door. I put that target on her back." "It wasn't your fault, Dom," Leo said, using the name no one else dared to use. "It was the kiss. Dmitry Petrov saw an opportunity. He saw a potential weakness and he decided to test it. And I let it happen." Dominic snarled, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I should have had her picked up the moment I knew Peterson was a problem. I should have forced her into a safe house." "And she would have hated you for it," Leo countered gently. "She would have felt like a prisoner. You tried to give her a choice. You tried to respect her." "Respect is a luxury," Dominic said, the words tasting like acid. "Survival is a necessity. My respect almost got her killed tonight." He was torn. A chasm had opened up inside him, splitting him in two. The man who had felt that spark, who had been captivated by her spirit and her art, wanted to give her space to let her keep her freedom. But the boss, the ruthless pragmatist forged in the fires of his family's bloody history, knew that freedom was an illusion. To protect her, he had to own her. He had to put her in a gilded cage so beautiful she might not realize it was a prison. The thought was sickening. It made him feel like his father. After dropping Leo at the private clinic, he gave his orders. A ghost team was assigned to Ava. They were the best, invisible, silent. They were to watch her from a distance, to report her every move, but not to engage unless her life was in immediate danger. He knew she would run to her friend Chloe. He had his team secure the building, placing men in vacant apartments, monitoring cameras, creating a perimeter of unseen protection. He was letting her have the illusion of escape while tightening a net around her. It was a compromise, a half measure, and he hated it. For days he was consumed by a cold fury. He interrogated the two captured thugs himself. They broke quickly. They were low-level muscle for the Petrovs, hired to snatch the girl, to send a message. His response was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours, the two key Petrov operations that funded Dmitry's personal ambitions went up in smoke, literally. A warehouse full of smuggled electronics burned to the ground. A money laundering front in a string of nail salons was raided by the feds thanks to an anonymous tip. He was sending a message back. "You touch what's mine and I will burn your world to ash." But it wasn't enough. It felt hollow, because Ava was still out there terrified and hating him. He sat in his silent office, staring at the picture of his mother, the weight of his legacy pressing down on him. He had built this empire to be strong, to be untouchable, so that what happened to her would never happen to anyone he cared about again. Yet here he was, and the very power he had amassed was the thing putting the person he was beginning to care about in the crosshairs. His phone buzzed, a secure line. It was the head of Ava's ghost detail. "Sir," the voice was grim, "we have a situation. There was a breach." Dominic's blood turned to ice. "Talk to me." An operative slipped past our perimeter. He was in and out in under 30 seconds. He left a package at the door of the friend's apartment. Dominic's fist clenched so hard he thought the phone would shatter. He had failed. His net, his protection, his half measures, they had all failed. He had tried to give her space, and in doing so, he had left a gap for the wolves to slip through. "What was in the package?" Dominic asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "A message and a dead bird." Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Dominic. It was quickly consumed by a rage so pure and white-hot it burned away all doubt, all conflict. The time for compromise was over. The time for respecting her wishes was over. Her fear of him was nothing compared to the reality of what the Petrovs would do to her. He had tried to be her protector from the shadows. Now he would have to be her cage.
The first wave was pure, paralyzing terror. Ava stared at the dead sparrow in the box, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, her vision tunneling until the only thing that existed was that small, broken body. It was a promise, a symbol. This is what would happen to her. She was a small, fragile thing caught in the gears of a machine she couldn't comprehend, and it was going to crush her. She slammed the lid shut, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the box. She stumbled back into the apartment, locking the door, her back sliding down the cool wood until she was huddled on the floor. Despair was a physical weight, a cold, heavy blanket threatening to suffocate her. She could run to the police, but what would she say? "A man I met in a bar is a mob boss and his enemies left a dead bird at my door?" They would think she was crazy. They couldn't protect her. No one could. She stayed like that for what felt like hours, adrift in a sea of hopelessness. But then, something shifted. Deep beneath the fear, a tiny, hot ember of anger began to glow. They thought she was a sparrow, a helpless little thing they could terrorize, a pawn to be sacrificed in their sick game. She thought of her life, the one she had fought so hard to build for herself after her parents died. Her small apartment, her dreams of painting, the simple, quiet peace she cherished. They were trying to burn it all down. The anger grew, a slow, rising tide, pushing back the fear. It was a cold, clarifying rage. She had spent her entire life being pushed around by circumstance, by grief, by men like Mark who thought her kindness was a weakness. She was done. She was done being the victim. Hiding was just a slower way to die. Running was an invitation to the hunt. The only way out was through. Her fear of Dominic Valenti was a real and tangible thing. He was a monster, a man who lived in a world of violence. But the Petrovs, the faceless people who had sent this box, were a different kind of monster. They were cowards who preyed on the innocent. Dominic, for all his darkness, had faced her. He had shown a strange, reluctant flicker of protection. He hadn't sent men to terrorize her. He had sent them to save her. In a world of predators, she had to choose the one whose motivations she could on some level understand. He was the devil she knew. A new resolve, hard and sharp as a shard of glass, settled in her soul. She stood up, her movements no longer trembling but deliberate. She walked into Chloe's kitchen, opened the junk drawer, and rummaged past the rubber bands and takeout menus until her fingers closed around the cold, heavy weight of the black metal card. She had asked Chloe to grab it from her apartment, along with a few other things, thinking she might need to throw it in the river. Now it felt like the only key she had left. She took out the SIM card she'd removed from her phone, slid it back in, and powered it on. She didn't look at the flood of messages that would surely be there from Chloe. She went straight to the keypad and dialed the number on the card. Her hand was perfectly steady. A man with a calm, professional voice answered on the first ring. Yes. I need to speak to Dominic Valenti, Ava said, her own voice sounding foreign to her, stripped of all emotion, flat and cold. There was a brief pause. Who is calling? Tell him it's Ava Collins. He'll know. One moment. She waited, her gaze fixed on the white box sitting on the coffee table. Less than a minute later, the man's voice returned. He's on his way. Where are you? She gave him Chloe's address and hung up. When the knock came 20 minutes later, she was ready. She looked through the peephole. It was him. Alone. She undid the locks and opened the door. He stood in the hallway, looking just as powerful and intimidating as ever, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a grim set to his jaw. His dark eyes scanned her face, searching for the hysteria, the terror he'd last seen. He wouldn't find it. Ava, he began, his voice low. Get in, she said, stepping back to let him pass. She closed and locked the door behind him. He stood in the middle of Chloe's quirky, colorful living room, looking like a panther in a dollhouse. His gaze swept the room before landing on the white box on the table. They found you, he stated. It wasn't a question. They didn't just find me, she said, her voice like ice. She walked to the table, picked up the box, and held it out to him. They left me a gift. He took the box, his expression unreadable. He lifted the lid and looked inside. A muscle in his jaw clenched, the only outward sign of the fury she knew must be simmering beneath the surface. He closed the box and placed it back on the table with a quiet, final click. I'm sorry, he said, and the words sounded genuine, torn from a place of deep regret. I don't want your apology, she said, meeting his intense gaze without flinching. I don't want your protection either. Not like this. Not hiding in the dark, waiting for the next little present to show up at my door. I want this to end. He watched her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. This was not the broken girl he had expected. I want my life back, she continued, her voice gaining strength. And you are the only one who can give it to me. So you and I are going to form a partnership. You are going to use whatever resources you have to eliminate this threat. And I, she said, taking a deep breath, am going to help you. She saw it then, a shift in his expression from grim resolve to a deep, profound respect. He saw her, not as a victim, not as a complication, but as an ally. As I was being dragged to the van, she said, forcing her mind back into the terror of that alley, I was fighting. I kicked one of them. I remember seeing his wrist when his sleeve rode up. He had a tattoo, a snake, eating its own tail. Dominic's focus sharpened. An Ouroboros. Yes, Ava nodded, a forgotten detail suddenly snapping into focus. But it was wrong. There was a small gap in the circle. The snake's head wasn't quite reaching its tail. It looked like a mistake in the design. A look of dawning, lethal understanding crossed Dominic's face. It was the first glimmer of hope she'd felt in days. That small, insignificant detail she'd noticed in a moment of pure panic had just given the devil a new weapon.
The call came as he was briefing his team. He was in the war room of his penthouse, a sterile, tech-filled space that contrasted sharply with the rest of his minimalist home. He was laying out the plan for Ava's forced extraction, his voice cold and clipped, his heart a block of ice in his chest. He had resigned himself to her eternal hatred. It was the price of keeping her alive. Then Leo had entered the room, holding a secure phone, his expression one of stunned surprise. It's for you, boss, Leo had said. It's her. Dominic took the phone, his mind racing. Was she hurt? Panicked? Had the Petrovs gotten to her again? This is Valenti. I need to speak to Dominic Valenti. Her voice, it was like a bucket of ice water, shocking the breath from his lungs. It wasn't the voice of a terrified victim. It was cold, controlled, and utterly devoid of fear. It was the voice of a woman who had walked through hell and come out the other side holding the devil's pitchfork. He went alone. Bringing a team would have been an act of intimidation, and he knew instinctively that this new version of Ava would not be intimidated. She would see it as a sign of disrespect. When she opened the door, he saw the change in her. The wild terror in her eyes was gone, replaced by a chilling, focused calm. The transformation was breathtaking. She had taken the fear the Petrovs had tried to poison her with and forged it into a weapon. When she handed him the box, his rage was a physical thing, a white-hot pressure behind his eyes. He wanted to hunt down Dmitry Petrov and tear him apart with his bare hands. The cowardice of it, the sheer sadism of terrorizing a civilian, an innocent. It violated every code, even the brutal ones that governed his world. He offered an apology because it was the only thing he could offer. Her rejection of it was swift and absolute. She didn't want his pity. She didn't want to be hidden away. She wanted to fight. She stood before him, pale and haunted but unbroken, and declared them partners. In that moment, the fierce, protective urge he felt for her deepened into something far more potent, something that bordered on reverence. And then she handed him the key. A snake, eating its own tail, with a small gap in the circle. The world tilted into sharp focus. It wasn't a mistake in the design. It was a mark. The soldati, the broken serpents. A small, vicious crew of mercenaries run by a man named Gregor. They worked for the highest bidder, known for being effective but notoriously disloyal. He had assumed Dmitry had used his own men, loyal Petrov soldiers. The fact that he hadn't meant everything. It meant Dmitry was operating outside his father's direct command, trying to make a name for himself. It meant he had a weakness, a loose thread. If Dominic could pull it, Dmitry's entire operation might just unravel. "That tattoo," Dominic said, his voice low and intense, "is the best news I've had all week. You may have just given us the weapon we need to end this." A plan, brutal and elegant, began to form in his mind. He could crush the soldati, find Gregor, and squeeze him until he gave up Dmitry. But that was messy. It would alert the Petrovs that he was onto their internal weakness. There was a better way, a cleaner way, a way to turn their own weapon back on them. He looked at Ava, truly looked at her. He saw the steel in her spine, the fire banked deep in her eyes. He was about to ask her to do the impossible, to walk willingly back into the fire. "Gregor, the man who runs this crew, is greedy," Dominic began, watching her reaction carefully. "And he's sloppy. If he thought he had another chance to get you, to collect his payday from Dmitry, he would take it." He let the implication hang in the air. "You want to use me as bait," she said, her voice quiet. There was no fear in it, only a grim understanding. "It would be dangerous," Dominic admitted, hating the words even as he said them. "But we would control the entire situation. The time, the place. My men would be everywhere. You would never truly be in danger. It would be a performance. But it would be the quickest, most definitive way to end this, to put Gregor in my debt and turn him into my instrument against Dmitry." He expected her to recoil, to refuse. He was ready to tell her to forget it, that he would find another way. The man in him screamed at him to lock her in a tower and never let her near a hint of danger again. But the boss knew this was the cleanest move on the board, and the partner standing before him deserved the truth. Ava was silent for a long moment, her gaze locked with his. He could see the battle raging within her. Then, she gave a single, decisive nod. "Fine," she said, her voice the sound of steel being forged. "Let's set a trap."
The Sloane Contemporary Gallery was Ava's church, a temple of quiet contemplation where color and shape and line spoke a language more profound than words. Tonight, it was an altar, and she was the sacrifice. The air, usually thick with the calming, earthy scent of oil paint and aged canvas, was sharp with the metallic tang of her own fear. Every shadow seemed to stretch, twisting into grotesque shapes in her peripheral vision. The polished steel sculptures reflected her image back at her, a distorted portrait of a stranger with haunted eyes and a jaw set like concrete. A tiny, almost invisible earpiece was nestled in her ear. It was her only connection to the world outside this beautiful, terrifying stage. "How are you doing, Ava?" Dominic's voice. It was a low, calm rumble in her head, a steady anchor in the swirling vortex of her anxiety. It wasn't the voice of a mob boss. It was the voice of the man who had seen her sketches and understood. "I'm fine," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. She pretended to be examining a large, abstract canvas, a chaotic explosion of red and black. It suited her mood. "Just admiring the art." "You're doing perfectly. They're 5 minutes out. Just keep breathing." Breathing. Right. It felt like a monumental task. She could feel the eyes of his men on her, unseen but ever present, hidden behind walls, in rafters, disguised as gallery staff. She was the safest person in New York City, and she had never felt more in danger. This was her choice, her path to freedom. She clung to that thought like a prayer. She wandered deeper into the gallery, her heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. She knew this space intimately. She knew the blind spots, the acoustics, the way light fell from the skylights at a certain angle. She stopped in the main atrium, a vast open space dominated by a single colossal sculpture of a fallen angel, its metal wings casting long, dramatic shadows. This was the designated spot, the kill box. The glass doors at the front of the gallery chimed softly. "They're here." Dominic's voice was a flat, cold line in her ear. "3 of them. Gregor is leading. Stay calm. Let them come to you." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trying to escape its cage. She didn't turn. She forced herself to remain still, her back to the entrance, a lone figure in the vast, empty space. She could hear their footsteps, heavy and purposeful, echoing on the floor. They weren't trying to be quiet. They were arrogant. They thought this was an easy job. "Ava Collins?" A voice with a thick Eastern European accent called out. "Gregor." She took a slow, deliberate breath and turned. 3 men stood there, silhouetted against the bright lights of the street outside. The man in the middle was shorter than the others, but built like a bulldog. His eyes were small, cruel, and intelligent. The man on his right had the broken circle tattoo visible on his wrist, the snake eating itself. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice impressively steady. It felt like someone else was speaking. "Mr. Petrov sends his regards," Gregor said, a greasy smile spreading across his face. "He's very eager to meet you. We're your escorts." He and his men began to advance on her, spreading out to cut off any escape. This was it, the moment the trap was supposed to spring. She tensed, waiting for the signal, for the sound of Dominic's men appearing from the shadows. But something was wrong. A flicker of movement in the reflection of the angel's polished wing. Not from the shadows where Dominic's men were supposed to be. It was from above. On the second-floor mezzanine, a 4th man. He was dressed as a gallery guard, but he held a small black object in his hand, and it was pointed not at Gregor's men, but at Leo, who was positioned near the stairwell, his own weapon concealed. They hadn't accounted for a 4th man, an infiltrator. There was no time to think. No time to warn Dominic. "Ava, what is it?" Dominic's voice was sharp with concern in her ear. She ignored him. In one fluid motion, born of pure, unthinking instinct, she lunged sideways and shoved the base of a tall, narrow pedestal next to her. A priceless ceramic vase, a cascade of blues and greens, toppled over. It hit the concrete floor with an explosive crash, a sound that ripped through the gallery's sacred silence like a gunshot. "Now!" she screamed. The world erupted.
From his position in the gallery's security office, Dominic watched the scene unfold on a dozen different monitors. He was a god of this small universe, seeing every angle, hearing every breath. Ava was a portrait of courage, a small, defiant figure in the center of his screen. Her calm was a testament to the steel he'd seen in her. But beneath his own cold, controlled exterior, his nerves were stretched taut. Every second she was in that room with those animals was a second too long. "They're here," he said into his microphone, his voice a flat line of command. "3 of them. Gregor is leading. Stay calm. Let them come to you." He watched them advance, his finger hovering over the button that would send the signal to his teams. His timing had to be perfect, close enough to ensure they were all inside, far enough that they couldn't lay a hand on her. Then he saw her body go rigid. She was staring at something he couldn't see, her focus absolute. "Ava, what is it?" he asked, a spike of cold adrenaline shooting through him. What had she seen? Had one of his men been compromised? Her answer was not a word, but an action. The sudden, violent crash of the vase was the only signal he needed. Something was wrong. The plan was compromised. "Go, now!" he roared into the comm system. On the screens, his men materialized from the shadows with silent, brutal efficiency. Doors burst open. Figures dropped from the rafters. The 3 thugs in the atrium didn't stand a chance. They were swarmed, disarmed, and subdued in a flurry of disciplined violence. It was over in 10 seconds. But Dominic's eyes were fixed on the mezzanine. He saw the 4th man, the fake guard, startled by the noise, bring his weapon up. He saw Leo, his ribs still taped, reacting a split second too slow. But Ava's scream, her diversion, had bought him the time he needed. Leo spun, his own gun appearing in his hand, and a single, suppressed phut echoed in the silent room. The 4th man crumpled over the railing, a puppet with its strings cut. A wave of fierce, savage pride washed over Dominic, so potent it almost buckled his knees. She hadn't just been the bait. She had been the lookout. She had seen the unseen threat. She had saved Leo's life. He was already moving, striding from the security office, his own weapon held loosely at his side. He walked into the atrium, a king surveying his conquered territory. His men were securing the subdued mercenaries, their faces grim. Leo was giving him a sharp nod of gratitude from the stairs, but Dominic only had eyes for Ava. She was standing by the fallen sculpture, her chest rising and falling, her eyes wide with the aftershock of what had just happened. She was safe. She was magnificent. He turned his attention to Gregor, who was being held on his knees by 2 of his largest men. The mercenary's arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by the pale, sweaty look of a man who had fatally miscalculated. Dominic knelt in front of him, his movements calm and unhurried. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet in the room was more terrifying than any shout. "You made a mess in my gallery, Gregor," Dominic said, his voice a soft, chilling murmur. "I was just doing a job, Valenti," Gregor spat, trying to summon some bravado. "Nothing personal." "Oh, it's always personal when you come after what's mine," Dominic replied smoothly. He gestured to the side, and Leo stepped forward, holding a tablet. Dominic took it and held it in front of Gregor's face. The screen showed a live video feed of an old woman sleeping peacefully in a hospital bed. Gregor's face went white. "My mother. What did you do?" "Nothing," Dominic said, "and I'll continue to do nothing. In fact, I've taken the liberty of paying her medical bills, all of them, for the rest of her life. I've even hired her a private nurse. She'll be very comfortable." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You work for me now, Gregor." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a statement of ownership. But this was only the first part of the checkmate. The real twist was yet to come. "You see, you and your employer, Dmitry Petrov, made a very big mistake," Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You thought this was about a girl, a message, leverage. You thought you were playing chess." He leaned in closer, his dark eyes boring into Gregor's. "While you were setting up your little board, I was buying the whole building. The information you gave my men when they persuaded you to set up this meeting was very illuminating. He stood up and began to pace, his voice calm, conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. As we speak, the federal authorities are raiding a certain warehouse in the Red Hook docks thanks to an anonymous tip about illegal arms. That was one of Dimitri's main sources of income. A container ship full of his untaxed cigarettes was just conveniently lost in a storm off the coast of New Jersey. His most trusted lieutenant in the Bronx just had a sudden change of heart and allegiance. It turns out loyalty is very affordable when the other side is about to be wiped off the map. He stopped and looked down at the broken man on the floor. This was never about catching you, Gregor. This was about announcing the end of the game. Dmitri Petrov has nothing left. His power, his money, his allies, they're all gone. As of tonight, he is a prince with no kingdom, and his father will be displeased. He had not just won the battle. He had revealed that the war was already over. He had dismantled his rival's entire world without firing a single shot in the open. It was a swift, silent, and absolute victory. He turned away from the ruins of Gregor's life and walked toward Ava. The noise, the men, the violence, it all faded away. The world shrank until it contained only the two of them, standing amidst the beautiful broken art. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze taking in her pale face, her steady eyes. She hadn't just survived his world. She had helped him conquer it.
The silence that followed Dominic's declaration was more profound than the crash of the vase. The controlled chaos of his men securing the scene, the low groans of the captured mercenaries, it all faded into a distant, unimportant hum. The world had shrunk to the space between them, charged with the ozone of violence and the electric current of something new and terrifyingly fragile. He walked toward her, and for the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had burned down a kingdom for her. He stopped a few feet away, his dark eyes searching hers, looking for cracks, for fear. She was sure he found them, but he also found the steel he had helped forge. "Are you all right?" His voice was a low rumble, stripped of its command, filled with a raw, genuine concern that made her knees feel weak. She could only nod, the words caught in her throat. All right? No. She would never be the same person she was a week ago. But she was alive, she was strong, she was whole. Leo approached, a clean white handkerchief pressed to his side, his face etched with a gratitude that needed no words. He gave Ava a deep, respectful nod before turning to Dominic. "It's done, boss. The place is clean. Ivan Petrov has already been sent a message about his son's rogue activities." Dominic's gaze never left Ava's. "Take everyone and go," he ordered quietly. "I'll handle this." His men melted away as silently as they had appeared, leaving the three of them, Dominic, Ava, and the fallen angel sculpture, alone in the vast, silent gallery. Dominic took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of her. He gently reached out, his fingers brushing a stray piece of shattered ceramic from her hair. His touch was feather-light, hesitant, as if he were afraid she might break. She didn't flinch. She leaned into the contact, a silent surrender that had nothing to do with defeat. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured. The ride in his car was a silent cocoon moving through the glittering, indifferent city. Ava stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her world slide by. But they looked different now, colored by the knowledge of the shadows that lay just beneath the surface. She wasn't afraid. The fear that had been her constant companion for days was gone, replaced by a strange, quiet calm. She was beside the biggest shadow of them all, and his presence was no longer a threat, but a shield. He didn't take her to Chloe's apartment or to his own stark, intimidating penthouse. Instead, he pulled up to a beautiful old brownstone on a quiet, tree-lined street in the village. He led her inside and up a flight of stairs to a sprawling top-floor apartment. It was nothing like his office. It was warm and filled with light, with polished hardwood floors and high ceilings. It was also completely empty, a blank canvas. Except for one room. He led her to a set of double doors and pushed them open. The room beyond was vast, with a wall made almost entirely of glass, a massive skylight overhead, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. In the center of the room sat a single professional-grade easel, a brand new set of paints, and a stack of fresh white canvases. Ava stopped, her breath catching in her throat. An art studio. Her art studio. He hadn't just saved her life, he had seen her soul. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes. Not tears of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. "You did this?" she whispered, turning to him. "I told you," he said, his voice soft. "It's not a hobby. It's who you are." They stood there for a long moment, the unspoken emotions a powerful current between them. The violence, the fear, the blood, it had all led them to this quiet, peaceful room. "Dominic," she began, finding her voice. "What happens now?" Ava stopped, her breath catching in her throat. An art studio. Her art studio. He hadn't just saved her life. He had seen her soul. Tears, hot and unexpected, welled in her eyes. Not tears of fear or sadness, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. "You did this?" she whispered, turning to him. "I told you," he said, his voice soft. "It's not a hobby. It's who you are." They stood there for a long moment, the unspoken emotions a powerful current between them. The violence, the fear, the blood, it had all led them to this quiet, peaceful room. "Dominic," she began, finding her voice. "What happens now?" He walked over to the massive window, looking out at the city that was his kingdom. "The threat is over. Dmitri Petrov is finished. His father values the old ways, the established order. He will deal with his son, Mark Peterson," he added, his voice hardening for a moment, "is facing federal fraud charges. He won't be a problem for you or anyone else ever again." He had tied up every loose end of her old life, every thread of her nightmare. He turned back to face her, his expression serious, his eyes holding a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I am offering you a choice, Ava, the one you should have had from the beginning." He pulled a sleek folder from his inside jacket pocket and set it on a windowsill. "In there is a passport, a new identity, and a bank account with enough money for you to go anywhere in the world and do anything you want. You can paint in Paris, study sculpture in Florence, anything. You will be completely safe, completely anonymous, and completely free of me and my world. I will never bother you again." She stared at him, stunned. He was offering her an escape, the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. He was giving her back her life, no strings attached. It was the most selfless, most noble thing she could have imagined. It was his way of letting go of control, of proving he wasn't the monster she had feared. She walked slowly toward the window, her gaze fixed on his face. She saw the man behind the Mafia boss, a man scarred by his past, a man who had built walls so high he'd forgotten how to feel the sun. She thought of a life in Paris, a life of quiet, solitary art. It was the dream she'd always thought she wanted, but now it felt empty. It felt like running again. She stopped in front of him, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She didn't look at the folder. She looked into his eyes. "You solved all my problems, Dominic," she said softly. "But you forgot about one." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "What's that?" "You," she whispered. "You're my problem now." She reached up and laid her hand against his cheek, the stubble scratching gently against her palm. "What if I don't want to be free of you? What if the life I want is the one that has you in it?"
As he walked toward her in the gallery, the adrenaline of the fight, the cold satisfaction of his victory, it all evaporated. All that remained was her. She stood there, unbroken, amidst the wreckage of his world, and he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he was looking at his future. He had spent his entire life building an empire of fear and power to protect himself from the vulnerability of love. Now he would burn that empire to the ground to protect the woman who had made him feel it again. The details of the aftermath were handled with cold precision. Ivan Petrov, a man who understood the old rules, was a pragmatist. His son had broken a truce and brought unwanted attention to their business by targeting a civilian under Dominic's protection. The consequences would be internal and severe. Dmitri was no longer Dominic's problem. The loose ends of Ava's old life were snipped, cauterized, and forgotten. Mark Peterson, a pathetic insect, was crushed under the weight of his own stupid crimes. It was all just business. But Ava was not business. She was everything else. Creating the studio apartment was an act of selfish hope. He knew he had no right to her. He had dragged her into the darkness, shown her the monster he was, and watched her run from it. But the part of him that was still a man, the part that hadn't been buried under the name Valenti, dreamed of a world where she could be herself, safe under his protection. He wanted to give her a sanctuary, a place where her light could flourish, untainted by his shadows. The drive to the brownstone was the longest drive of his life. Her silence was a heavy weight in the car. He didn't know if it was the silence of fear, of trauma, or of contemplation. When they stood in the empty studio, and he saw the tears well in her eyes, his heart, a thing he'd long thought dead, ached with a pain and a tenderness he didn't know how to handle. Offering her the folder was the hardest thing he had ever done. It was his penance, his act of contrition. For years he'd controlled everything and everyone around him. Possession was power, but he had learned from her that real strength, real power, lay in letting go. He had to give her the choice to leave, to be free. It was the only way to prove to her and to himself that he was not the monster his father had been. If she walked away, it would gut him, but he would let her go. He owed her that. He owed her everything. He watched her walk toward him, her beautiful, determined face set, and he braced himself for the end. He prepared for the quiet thank you, the sad smile, the sound of her footsteps walking out of his life forever. But she didn't take the folder. She touched his face. Her touch was a brand, a spark that reignited every nerve in his body. What if the life I want is the one that has you in it? The words hit him with the force of a physical blow. The walls he had spent a lifetime building, the fortress of ice around his heart, didn't just crack. They shattered into a million pieces. Hope, fierce and blinding, flooded the empty spaces. She was choosing him. Not the boss, not the power. Him, the man who had shown her his absolute worst. A sound escaped his throat, a rough, ragged sound of disbelief and profound relief. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm tighter against his cheek, needing the anchor of her touch to believe this was real. Ava, he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. My world is dark. It's violent. You deserve the sun. Then you'll just have to learn to stand in the light with me, she replied, her eyes shining with a strength that humbled him. And that was it. The final surrender. He leaned in and kissed her, and it was nothing like their first kiss. That had been a desperate act of theater. This was a sacrament. It was a kiss of raw honesty, of shared futures, of a darkness finding its light. It was tender and deep, a promise of protection, a vow of partnership, a celebration of a love that had been forged in the most unlikely of fires. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. For the first time in his life, Dominic Valenti was not in control. He was completely, utterly, and irrevocably in love. And in that surrender, he had finally found his victory. He had the girl, he had the hope of a future, and for the first time his sprawling, empty kingdom finally felt like a home.